Hey guys, so this is a video about happiness. It's kind of a complicated, pretty broad subject, and I wanted to bring it up because it has to do with all of our mental health and our expectations and that kind of stuff. The idea that we can't have is that happiness is a machine. The idea that happiness could come from something that we build would just essentially be replicated over and over again. Anybody who's trying to sell us happiness as a machine is obviously just marketing something. Because happiness, does it really come from Japan? No. It could be branded. Happiness can be a promise. Happiness can be something that somebody's trying to sell to us, and that's just ridiculous. It's not real happiness. So, what is real happiness? Does happiness come from chemicals? Are we just like is the sum of our construction, our brains? Is it just a matter of having the right balance of chemicals inside of us to feel happiness? Is that all there is? What happens when you can't get the happiness you want? You wind up taking all types of medications, right, to help you cope, and then you self-medicate. You go around and you think to yourself, okay, well, I don't want to think of my troubles anymore, so I'm going to get alcohol, or I'm going to get more caffeine, or I need to feel this certain way to function in my life. And so I just keep adjusting these levels of serotonin, dopamine, and other endorphins to make myself more and more and more and more happy, or because I'm bored, or I can't get the things that I want. And it's a deep issue, but I mean, you wind up with too many drugs, and what happens? You run into a life of addiction. These are actual photos of San Francisco, where drug culture is just out in the public. The dude over here is getting his life pumped back into him or something, and this dude over here is stealing his stuff. What's going on? This guy, they're in a court setting somewhere, getting ready to go to court, and I don't even know if he's sentient anymore. But this dude's shooting up in the courthouse. It's nuts. If we looked up unhealthy brain in Google, it's kind of telling to see that bad habits that can hurt your brain. That idea that health and mental health, we have to focus on it a lot bigger than just simple endorphins and simple chemicals. So we're walking into the realm of psychology here. And psychology happens to be a soft science. The soft sciences deal with intangibles and relate to the study of human and animal behaviors, interactions, thoughts, and feelings. It has to do with beliefs and outcomes. The experimental data sets within a soft science like psychology have to do with case studies, surveys, demographic demographic data, census data, and that kind of stuff. Whereas a hard science like chemistry has to do with, well, let's measure the temperature after we put chemical X and chemical Z together. And then you can repeat that anywhere. Those chemicals are not going to change. Let's look out into the stars and see what the spectrograph of this light coming back from this planet is, so we can tell what's inside the atmosphere. That's a hard science. But this is a soft science, and belief and outcome are measured over long periods of time over lots of people through surveys, demographic data, census data, and case studies. Well, guess what? Soft science then could be thought of as historical introspection, right? You can go back into history and see opinions and outcomes based off of how things have happened over long periods of time in history. So sociology, psychology, that kind of stuff is a soft science. And the Bible provides an interesting, very relevant scenario for us to look at happiness. So theology comes into play. Here's a guy with a really old Bible. Is he trying to sell us this? Is he overselling? Is this the happiness machine, perhaps? I don't think so. It's not that simple, so don't believe anybody who tells you that. But I do think we can draw some meaning out of theology, because if we're looking at the soft sciences and beliefs and outcome, the Bible and theology has a lot to do with how we construct our inner selves, what we consider ourselves, what we consider what's good and bad, what we consider as inside something to pursue and outside of something to pursue when we're trying to find our own happiness. So I think it's relevant. Here's a Bible verse that has to talk about it. This is the first of all the Psalms, so it's a very important psalm, and it talks about freedom and happiness. Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with mockers. They delight in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night. They are like trees planted along the riverbank. Really pretty trees. That's the way it's talking about. It's talking about a tree on a riverbank. it's got what it needs, and it grows and grows and grows over a long period of time. They're like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit in each season. Their leaves never wither, and they prosper in all they do. Not the wicked. They're like worthless chaff scattered by the wind. That's chaff. A farmer would know what that is, but we don't. So you can see the chaff blowing, these little speckles of stuff blowing in the wind. That's how you would separate wheat and chaff. So you can see here as he pours it out of this bin, the wind throws the chaff away. And so that's what it's saying. The Bible says the wicked are like this. People who choose evil, they're with the grain, but they get separated from the grain, and they're lighter than the grain. They are like worthless chaff scattered by the wind. They will be condemned at the time of judgment. Sinners will have no place among the godly, for the Lord watches over the path of the godly, but the path of the wicked leads to destruction. So if we're looking at happiness and joy and that kind of stuff from a biblical standpoint, we've got to consider things that have to do with chaff and trees and good and bad, that kind of thing. I thought of this, and this is kind of like what generated the whole video idea. I was trying to figure out a way to animate this for you. So let's say that a tree grows with rain and it grows with light, right? If you overlap the rain and the light, you get this green space, and this green space is a place that the trees. So for us to have happiness, we need to have freedom to go and find our happiness. Somebody who's happy is definitely, if they have very little freedom and their desire or their hopes are very great, it's like they're in a prison, right? Is that happiness? Do trees grow with way too much light and not enough rain? No, they don't grow. So let's flip it around. Let's say you have tons and tons of freedom. You can do anything you want. You're the super richest person in the entire earth, but you really are kind of like this hopeless, desireless, very, very small things. Nothing really is left that's going to make, your freedom is huge. Your hope and your light of happiness is really small. So trees don't grow very well with a lot of rain, too much wet, and not enough light. It's not a position of growth. So having both of these things balanced, I think, is the way that you want to experience happiness. These things need to overlap. You need the freedom and you need the hope and the desire. And so the Bible talks about trees as being kind of an illustration of how people are. If these things overlap correctly, the Bible verse was talking about how they're planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit in each season. Their leaves do not wither, and they prosper in all they do. And they're also a benefit to other people. It grows slowly, and it's useful to everyone. It's useful to this little squirrel guy to be inside of the nice big tree that's growing well. So how can I be happy, you wonder? How can I be like a tree? That's all very nice and that's all very poetic, but what is it actually doing to make me happy? Let's go a little more specific into it. Let's get more focused onto how it works, the way that we actually function. I think that happiness has a lot to do with perception, scope, and expectation. Your perception is perhaps, I like tattoos just like this kid, or I like sunglasses like this girl. And the scope is it even realistic? Can I get a tattoo? Well, I guess you can. Maybe a child should have like a temporary tattoo because these probably are not real. They're just cute temporary tattoos on their face and stuff. If not, then you kind of wonder about these parents' capability to raise children. So that is capable. Expectation. What is in my way from getting this thing? What is it that I need to do to get this thing? When will it happen? How far away is it? So if this child would only be happy if he could have that very specific tattoo and it had to be a real tattoo, then he's, going to have to go wait a long time to get to the tattoo parlor and have that put on him. If this girl's going to be happy only if she's going to be a movie star, and her perception is, I like movie stars, I like looking pretty in front of people. Is it realistic? Yes, she's seen other movie stars on TV. Expectation. What's in my way? Well, I need to get out of school. I need to do this other stuff. So these perception, scope, and expectations all have to do with our goals and the realization of those goals and our happiness. Let's take it into a different dimension. Let's look at the past. Back in the 1700s, or in the time of the Bible, life hadn't changed very much from the time of the Bible until about the 1700s, right? After that, things started to really take off. The dads back then they were just the dads, right? Look at this guy talking about how the women should churn the butter or whatever in the world that contraption is. The toys the kids had were like hoops, right? The jobs they had were threshing the wheat by hand, terrible things. The drugs they had were maybe like, I don't know, pipes. The stuff they had, look at this girl's pony and this dog, and that was it. That's all they could really get. The travel, the amount of travel you could possibly travel in the biblical time or back then during this time was very small. Expectations, scope, perception was very different back then during the Bible than now. So is it even relevant? I think it is. I'm going to build a case for that we should look at the Bible and consider these things. But I did want to at least bring up the point that they are very different. Now, if you look at our time versus the time of the Bible, the choices that they had back in the day were like this, right? Just a few items to make themselves happy. They would have went into a store, the marketplace, or some place that they would have had that was near them to be able to purchase or obtain things that they dreamed of having, or they would have been, exposed to different jobs or different positions or different opportunities, and that scope would have been very small. They wouldn't have had a lot of choices. But as far as today goes, just illustrating this, the store difference, nowadays, if you go on Amazon, you have the choice of 564 million different items if you live in the United States. Back in the day, the expectation of your jobs and your wealth and that kind of thing, you would have looked up at the top, and the queen would have been something, or the king or the monarchy on top of the lords, and the lords on top of the people. That pyramid scheme, you still probably didn't have that much difference between the classes and the kind of things they would have had. They would just had nicer and nicer things, and the types of jobs that they could have performed would have been not as varied as the kind of jobs and tasks we would have had today. So especially the type of wealth that they had back then versus the type of wealth we have now. And if you would have thought back then, well, I could never obtain to the top, well, guess what? If you're in America and you speak English, you actually are on the top. So we have to think of ourselves not within sort of that hierarchical structure of peasants and illiterate farmers, but we really should think of ourselves as kings with a lot of capability and a lot of choice. And that is something that we have to consider when we look at the biblical model, because the biblical model is going to show a very small scope versus the large scope that we have nowadays. And that is important for considering is the Bible still something we want to look at? Because here we have this dimension, so to speak, perception, scope, and expectation that is very small versus very large. And I want to show that in the dimension of imagination. This is where we want to go to view that. If you lived in the 1700s, you'd have thought to yourself, well, I only have this one dream, and I only have this little tiny bit of freedom, and my desires only exist, my one and only desire only exists inside this little box. But if you live in 2022, right, and we are like the kings of the earth, if you live in America, well, then your ideas and your capabilities and the type of choices you make extend out and have a much broader width and depth and height than anything that would have existed back then. You might think, well, the Bible was written way before 1700. Maybe it doesn't apply at all. My discussion from this point on is that it does still apply unless you take this materialistic, physical realm only type of concept. When it comes to imagination, it's very different. Somebody back then couldn't have possibly imagined anything that we could imagine nowadays. But I believe that's the least most dimension, the one that's closest to our perception. And there are other dimensions on top of that we will explore, but that is the dimension of imagination. Let's look at the dimension of focus. Let's say that you have a very closed and narrow focus. I want a very specific thing. Nothing but this one thing will make me happy. It's like seeing life through a microscope. I'm very, very focused, very, very specifically driven to this one sort of thing. So this is a dimension. It wraps on the outside of the imagination. The thing of all the things that you can imagine, what if your microscope of thought focused on a just very, very, very tiny specific thing, and if you had to have that one thing inside that little box, or you just were not going to be happy? Out of everything out here, that doesn't seem like that's a really good way of pursuing mental health to me. And neither is the other way. Let's say there was an extremely far expectation. I plan on getting a car of this type after so many years. I plan on getting a certain very specific job or degree from a very specific college. I plan on having a wife and kids and a big house by the time I'm 30. Or I plan on having a bunch of accolades to my name because I'm a victorious video gamer or something like that. Or eventually I'll be super happy and wealthy, but I've just got to put in the hard work now for the next 10 years. That's like a telescope view of the mind. And that's on the outside of the imagination. Your focus can determine how your eyes, your focus can determine how you perceive and have a scope and have an expectation based off your happiness. So these are other factors, other dimensions outside of that. So somebody who had like a certain focus, they might be very specifically still having a very narrow field of view of happiness, but it's a dimension of time. I plan on having that at some time. So they're willing to go through a lot of pain eventually to get to their happiness. Whereas this one doesn't really matter about the time. They're thinking about the very specific, very thing now, but they can't have many more things except for the one thing that they want for their happiness. Hope that makes sense. I think this is the best way to look at it. I think having a near but adjustable, a fluid set of eyes, a very fluid scope of focus makes a more balanced person. And also having maybe a far-sighted but not extremely far-sighted idea of expectation. So I'm going to look about a year out, and I'm going to say in about a year out, I'm going to get me this one thing I'm seeing on the internet out of all the choices, but that's what's going to make me happy. And you know what? If I don't get that one thing, well, then something similar. What that does is that broadens out this to a more stable point of view. You don't get infatuated. You don't get addicted to a very specific thing. You're okay with life's little bumps and movements that move your freedom around, or your light and desires. They can all move. They can be fluid, and that matches real life a lot more specifically. And so I think that that's two ways in our frame of mind that might not have existed in the 1700s. They wouldn't have had a lot of focus or imagination because they're stuck in the realm that they're in. But in 2022, we have to retain a certain amount of focus to constrain our imagination to the point that we're not so all the ideas and all the concepts out there telling us how to be happy that somebody's trying to sell us. We have to limit that down to a set that that I think happiness is conducive in. Because once again, the kind of happiness that we want is we want the perfect overlap of freedom and hope and desire. We want a situation where the light and the rain are both in equal measure, and there's a lot of happiness, and there's not much light or rain wasted. That's what we want, right? That's, I think, is the balanced approach. Now, there's another dimension, and this is where the Bible talks about it, the dimension of good and evil. And this is on the outside of both of these things. So we have three dimensions. Inside those, we have our own perception, scope, and expectation. The dimension of good and evil really kind of like looks at what is it the thing that you desire? Is the thing you desire a good thing or an evil thing? Well, some things are not good or evil, right? I want to have a certain job. That's not good or evil. But what if the job you want to have produces evil, or the desires that you have are evil desires? Well, how would you know, right? You've got to look at what it does. Does it hurt others? Does it break the law of God or something like that? And that's the way the Bible approaches this health of this tree. You can have any imagination you want, you can have any focus you want, but you have to contain it within a certain lens of good and evil. If you erase the good and the evil, then people can have a perception, expectation, and they can be happy doing things that are, who cares? I think it's, so if somebody decides they're going to override their endorphins today with some caffeine or maybe enjoy the party a lot with some recreational drugs or something like that, is that good or evil? Well, it's not. It doesn't really fall into the good or the evil realm until it becomes something of a pattern of an unhealthy lifestyle and addiction. But we can be addicted to all kinds of stuff. How much money is good or evil? Well, are you addicted to the money? Does it start to harm other relationships? Does it start to, are you becoming a really power hungry person along with your money? Are you becoming something that harms other people? Are you failing to love your neighbor as yourself? See how this works? See how the good and evil can be outside the focus of the imagination, the perception, and happiness? So you have tons and tons of choice inside of what you want to do with your life. And then God says on the outside of it, He's going to bless the people They're like trees planted along a riverbank, bearing fruit each season. Their leaves never wither, and they prosper in all they do. And at the end, the Lord watches over the paths of the godly, but the path of the wicked leads to destruction. He just wants to make sure within your focus and your imagination, you have tons and tons of freedom inside of the dimension of good and evil. And the way you think about the Bible usually, and the way this dimension of good and evil starts to kind of override the dimensions of freedom and hopes and desires, is that there's like this sinful, fleshly, bad desires and rules. And you can see this in some of the old laws of the Old Testament. You can't eat pork. You can't work on Sunday. Well, the New Testament doesn't really have those types of laws. It did away with the laws of the Old Testament and fulfilled them, in that we have the law of love. We, through the Spirit, want only things that are, that fulfill the law of love. I can do anything that I want to as long as it doesn't conflict with the love that I have or the love that I'm obliged to have for other people. So if I'm at my work and my job and I love my work, great. But if I'm at my work so much that my family's becoming estranged from me, and and I'm destroying the relationship I have with my family, then I've broken the law of love, and my freedom and my hopes and desires of pursuing my career might actually be fleshly and sinful. I have the freedom to do it, but it falls below this. And there's a balance and there's a complexity. But that's the way it starts. When somebody says to themselves, I want to do it the way God wants me to do it, it starts with the laws and the rules, because it's just the simplest way to explain it. You need to have the law of love. The way it ends is like this. Eventually, people's hopes and desires, the happiness that's generated eventually, is a way where their freedom and their hopes arise out of the sinful, dark, bad area, and they rise up into a righteous area where they can do things that make them happy that nobody else would think would make them happy. So, for instance, somebody might be so generous that they don't have any earthly desires. Their righteousness, their spirit, their love, they find that they only want to do righteous things. It didn't start that way. They didn't begin with that thought. But as their focus, their imagination started to change, started to be warped, so to speak, in a good way, their focus and the imagination only desired eventually things that are righteous. And so that's a way that the Bible tries to change people and tries to help them make those good choices. They think to themselves, oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked. What's the advice of the wicked? Go get those drugs. Go get that money. Go get that happiness. Go get that one thing that you want to have. Go buy this. Go do that. The advice of the wicked. Some of those things aren't bad, but they might play out to be bad over time. And you can change your focus and imagination. You can change your perception, scope, and expectation yourself. The evil and the good, if you keep choosing that and you keep choosing things that are righteous, you eventually start to only like righteous things because your spirit is starting to change. That's kind of the scriptural, biblical way of talking about what I'm trying to explain here, this complexity I'm trying to unfold here. So the way it ends is that righteous people rule with no rules. The Bible says that the meek shall inherit the earth, and that all the things that the wicked gather up are eventually going to be the inheritance of the righteous. And we don't chase after those things. The rich, the greedy chase after money. The powerful, those who are in power chase after control. And those are sinful fleshly desires. They're not bad in of themselves. Money's not bad. Control's not bad. But when you try to enslave other people and you try to never give away your money or help those who have less than you, then you're committing a sin, and it's a bad thing. Over time, I'll leave it at this. The righteous eventually only want righteous things, but at the beginning, it looks like, and maybe to everybody else who doesn't understand how this works, it looks like it's just a matter of rules and regulations. And then it turns into somebody who's perfectly happy. Their happiness is complete. They've only started wanting righteous things. So let's see the Bible actually say what we're talking about. This is the way it starts. Starts with the flesh, turns into sin, it ends in death. So you have two paths the way the Bible speaks of. The mind governed by the flesh is death, But the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of flesh cannot please God. So it's describing that black and white sin path versus the life path. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, but it is not to the flesh, to live according to it. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. It's talking about the beginning and the end right there. See, it starts with the flesh. Eventually, the fleshly things turn into spiritual acts and you become a sinful person. And then at the end, those sinful attributes and acts become under death, because God will judge those who have done sinful acts for their entire lives, and they'll be like, you've been sinning your whole entire life. You don't have my Spirit within you. You've never repented. Look at the path you've taken. So that's the way the two paths work out. And so here's the rest of it. This is also in Romans chapter 8. This is the biblical view of how it winds up being, in a positive way, chasing happiness. Because somebody who's chasing the path of their flesh is actually chasing their happiness. They want these things, but they want them without the dimension of good and evil. They want them just based off their focus, their imagination, their perception, scope, and expectation. They don't care about how good and evil works. That's how that works out. This is somebody who cares how good and evil works and wants to do what God wants. I consider our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So they have sort of like a telescope view, right? Back when I was talking about this, these people are looking out over time and they're thinking to themselves, okay, well, I want this one thing, but I'm going to look at it with this telescope hope. I'm going to have a view that reaches out across eternity, and maybe it's having both of these at the same time, right? Like, I'm going to look to my normal happiness, but eventually he knows, Paul knows, and he wants everybody who's a Christian to know that that God has revealed that over the period of time that there's going to be the end, and it's going to be their life or death end. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to our glory that was revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subject to frustration, not by its own choice, but by will of the one who subjected it. So God created this planet in the hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. He's saying that there's two ways to look at it, and the way for the Bible is to contain the focus and the imagination inside how the Bible calls good and evil, because there will be a glory revealed in us. So that eventually that glory revealed in us is that the light and hope of our desire eventually will have no rules. We'll be without rules. We'll only want good, and we'll be given that good for all of eternity that we want. And that's the hope and the light of our freedom. The good and the freedom that we have and the light and hope that we want will all come into completely overlap, and everything that we want will be fulfilled, and we'll have the freedom to pursue anything we want. See how that works out? So it starts off with death. The present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So we die to the sinful flesh that we have. It goes, and then it looks like rules. We're keeping ourselves in expectation of a certain thing out into the future. We're putting constraints on ourselves not to do evil, but to limit our expectations and to limit our imaginations to only things that are good. And that ends up in life, because we believe that eventually there'll be a greater life that we'll never want death or hell. We won't want anything bad. We won't want anything sinful. That eventually it starts with this rule-based system where we try to train ourselves to not want certain things or not do certain activities. And eventually at the end, we won't even want those things anymore. We'll be swallowed up in life, so to speak. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. So it's talking against materialism. Don't go out there and grab everything you can. And that works both in the Bible times, the 1700s, and it works up until nowadays. You can't derive all your happiness from things. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. And if the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? This is talking about, I think, what you want. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, the things you want, if you want things that are good, your whole body will be full of good. And so that's why I've put it like this, that the dimension of good and evil, the lamp of your body, your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. The ideas of the Bible wrap around the focus of the imagination, perception, scope, and expectation that we have. And that constrains those things. And we kind of put that, in other words, the way I say this is you put the Bible at the base of your life. You make it the foundation of your life to follow Jesus' teachings. Those things are the paramount thing, the base thing, the first thing. And then everything else after that follows from there. I'm not, and this is another way Paul talks about it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, because he's talking about being a missionary who had very little or a lot at different times in his life. For I've learned to be content over whenever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether to be fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or want. I can do all these. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. And so we're not alone when we're in want or content. We're not by ourselves. If we have this idea of good and evil wrapped around us, then it is actually God who's informing us, who's guiding us, who's making that tree grow where it should grow, like it said in Psalm 1. It's not something that we generate out of ourselves. We don't use our imagination, our focus, and the truth that we have within ourselves to make us content. It comes from without ourselves. We look to the promises of God and eventually of how he has designed this world to reward those who have done his will or not, to look for our happiness. And so in a way, we are looking forward. We are having a focus on things outside of us to provide us with happiness and a thought of that. So just to wrap it up again, to maintain good mental health, to maintain happiness is not with drugs or materialism. It is with balancing the light and hope and the desire to allow the tree of life to grow. In that, the weird thing about our reality is that everything is available to us to consider and to imagine and to focus on. Everything through the computer, through the information age that we live in right now, is much broader in scope. And so we can be pickier, and we have to be careful of our focus and our imagination, but continue to use the Bible to wrap all of this, our perception, scope, and expectations within good and evil to make that happen. And that's how we do it. Yeah. So if anybody's trying to sell you something, just beware of people who try to take these religious ideas and turn them to their own power or control. They're perverting the Bible. Beware.